Good afternoon, everyone, to the EGPP seminar series taking place today. For the new faces here, my name is Lorenzo Cicchi, and I am the coordinator of the EGPP, and I will be chairing today's session. And I also want to extend the speaker and the audience the excuses of Daniele Caramani, the director of EGPP, who couldn't be here today. So the EGPP seminar series combines various types of presentation. We have book presentations, research seminars, and other types of events, including special events that take place after a specific event in Europe and in the world. Today we are happy to have Luis Russo presenting his research on a reappraisal of determinants of EU attachment after the invasion of Ukraine, which is part of an ongoing research that he has on European solidarity and others. He's a researcher as a SPS department, but he's also part of a big project that is part of the umbrella of EGPP on solidarity in Europe, around which we had last week a big conference of today. So in a sense, he plays in a home turf here at the Schuman Center in Villa Schifanoia. As for the format and housekeeping, Luis will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, so it's going to be a very relaxed and no rush presentation, after which we will go straight to the Q&A discussion with the members of the audience, so without an assigned discussant. This is pretty much it. So thanks again, Luis, for being here. Thanks to the audience for participating to this seminar. So without further ado, Luis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and of course everyone for being here and allowing me to share my research with you. So the presentation is exactly as Lorenzo was saying, uses data from the project where we participate, Solidarity in Europe project that collects it fields a yearly survey and collects data on attitudes towards European solidarity and the EU in general. And so essentially this is a lot of information that I'll try to pack it. I have a generous amount of time, but in principle, this presentation pertains to two papers, and as you will see, it has two different designs in it, and essentially it is motivated by the need to reappraise correlates of EU attachment, particularly after the war in Ukraine and the rallying effect, the effect that it generated in 2022, which is when the data for this paper was collected. So we need to think of this paper in light of the time, in light of the events of 2022. So the theoretical framework starts with the fact that after Maastricht and an increasing politicization of EU domestically, and if you don't mind, I'm going to stand up. So if I think all can hear me correctly. So after Maastricht and the increasing politicization of EU issues domestically, post-functionalists argued that there was an inherent tension between the expansion of supranational authority and, of course, preservation of self-rule, of national culture, particularly among those with exclusive national identity. So there's providing a very central role for identity, for regional integration. And in time, they suggest populist parties, populist political actors would mobilize, would politicize the EU domestically, mobilize anti-EU contestation, and thus in time generate a certain downward trend in regional integration, in the level and scope of integration, which Hoge and Marx called constraining dissensus. Now, what we see, however, is since this seminal paper, we've seen that the developments have somewhat challenged these assumptions. So on the one hand, on the supply side, we see that, as many liberal intergovernmentalists would say, we see that integration has continued untempered, from fiscal and financial integration during the Euro crisis to the recent expansion in fiscal solidarity during COVID with the Eurobonds. Also, in the demand side, we see that particularly after COVID and Ukraine, which are what Cris and Ferreira conceptualizes common crises. These are crises that are exogenous in nature, so you cannot pinpoint exactly who to blame. Probably it's hard to establish a narrative of blame in opposition to previous crises such as the Eurozone crisis, which was the fault of the profligate South. And these are also crises that generate symmetric or quasi-symmetric crisis pressures across borders. So they're felt by every member state in the EU, and they're also perceived to be better addressed collectively rather than bilaterally. So these types of crises, as COVID and Ukraine are, would elicit stronger support for burden sharing in the EU and eventually consolidate the bonding dimension of the EU polity. And indeed, there's research that points in that direction. So both from the supply and the demand side, we see that these developments challenge the key post-functionalist assumption that there's this tension between that the expansion of EU integration would always face popular opposition. So the main argument of the paper is then that against these recent crises and against a backdrop, the backdrop of a world in flux, citizens would increasingly look to the EU for insurance, would increasingly look to the EU as an insurer of economic resilience and domestic security against this common exogenous adversity. So basically, in other words, what I mean to say is that these crises will generate functional needs that would supersede identity-based opposition against the EU, as had been the case hitherto. So this background would then allow a new relevance to economic and security determinants of EU attachment, and therefore the propriety of this appraisal at this time. So this is how the paper starts. Then moving on to the hypothesis, I've just basically illustrated why I think that cultural determinants are not are not such good predictors of EU attachment in the post-Ukraine context. Also, in terms of national security, one would also think that they would not be the strongest correlates because of the limited scope of the common security and defense policy, essentially the scarce EU portfolio in terms of security, for both in the treaties and also in public opinion. National security obligations are materialized under the NATO umbrella and not the EU. So one would also think that these would be secondary drivers of EU attachment. By contrast, economic perceptions would, in this case, according to the theoretical framework of this paper, I believe they would be strong correlates of EU attachment, because not only because these, we're talking about 2022, when energy prices skyrocketed, the inflation crisis aggravated, and indeed, as I was saying, and indeed bringing up the salience of the economic crisis. Germany had entered recession because of this. So the economic crisis was very salient at the time, but also due to the learning effects of the COVID crisis, particularly with the EU, with the EU's role as a fiscal insurer, particularly in the economic recovery, the post-COVID economic recovery with Next Generation EU. I would expect also that there are some learning effects of the EU as a sort of economic stabilizer in the context of crisis. So essentially, these would support the contention that EU attachment should be primarily directed by economic perceptions. That is, the way I conceptualize it is, or operationalize it. I'm talking about perceptions on how EU membership positively or negatively impacts the domestic economy. So basically, sociotropic economic expectations. Now, this is hypothesis one. Hypothesis two basically mirrors the same framework for an experimental design that I've conducted, which I will speak to in a moment. But essentially, I expect that framings emphasizing economic implications from EU membership would have a larger effect than framings emphasizing cultural and security implications from membership. Now, a quick word on the data. As Lorenzo was saying, this data was collected on the 2022 wave of the Solidarity in Europe data set. It has collected data on 16 member states, over 24,000 respondents. It's a very large survey. It is representative at the national level with the usual variables, education, age, and gender, and it was collected in a very specific and very special time between the 5th and the 8th week after the invasion, which provides a very useful window into attitudes at that time, but also distant enough from the invasion that would allow citizens, that would allow Europeans to think of the relation to the EU in face of the in face of the invasion. So basically allowing them to think how the EU could stand, how the EU could be an agent of resilience and stability in face of the shock that the invasion of Ukraine generated. Now, the paper, as I was saying, it essentially has two parts that may develop into two different papers. It's still a work in progress, obviously. The first part is uses observational data, simple OLS analysis, with the difference that it uses two sets of models. One model operationalizes the independent variables as continuous 11-point Likert scale variables, and the second models use, of course, the same dependent variable, EU attachment, but now the independent variables are categorical variables. So why do I do this? I do this because I employ a categorical independent variable to allow more qualitative assessment, essentially allowing me to uncover the links between different mental schema of what it means to be in the EU and the impact of this schema on EU attachment. And I'll talk to this very briefly. The second part of the paper is, as I was mentioning before, this experimental design, where I measure the effect of different economic, cultural, and security framings on EU attachment, basically different vignettes emphasizing a positive or a negative implication of EU membership, and how these different manipulations and the effect of these different manipulations in EU attachment. So the dependent variable is this. How attached do you feel to the European Union on a 0 to 10 scale? Pretty straightforward question. We see that 5, the middle point is a more popular category, as is usually the case in questions about the EU. But we do see, with some positivity, I would say, that the majority of the respondents are on the upper half of the distribution. So we have generally in 2022, we had rather positive view of a EU attachment. And here are the independent variables. I know that the lettering is a bit small to see, but starting with the continuous variables, these essentially the question, the economic perceptions, we ask respondents how they think EU membership impacts their domestic economy. How it affects their economy from losing a lot to benefiting a lot, so the national economy losing a lot and benefiting a lot from EU membership. The same thing for the impact of EU membership on national culture, from undermining to enriching national culture. And finally, the impact on national security from the country being a lot less protected to a lot more protected by being in the EU. Turning then to the categorical variable, which is the meaning of EU, we ask, when you think of the EU, what do you think of? And we provide 6 different possibilities, which essentially mirror what we were looking for in the continuous variables. So we have a positive economic, so economic growth and jobs, economic stagnation and unemployment being the positive and negative for economic, and this model is then repeated for culture. It enriches and provides cultural diversity, or it generates a loss of national culture. When I think of the EU, I think of security against external aggression, or an increased risk of external aggression. One would think, perhaps because of the common obligations under the Common Security and Defense Policy in the Solidarity Clause, one country that is potentially away from a possible source of military tension would then be drawn into the conflict by means of being in the EU. So essentially, this would be the reasoning behind this option. Although it is a bit implausible, it was still a possibility, and not the least popular. In any event, so these are the independent variables. And here are the results of the continuous model, the correlation coefficients of the continuous model. Now we see that the controls have become insignificant after the addition of the independent variables, which are these 3: economic, culture, and security perceptions I was just talking about, which is a good sign. The independent variables, of course, are in this model the most important drivers of attachment to the EU. All of them significant at below 0.01 level. Although we do see that between the 3 economic perceptions are the most important driver in the model are the most important correlate of EU attachment, with on average respondents being 4% more attached to the EU for each additional level of positive expectations, positive economic expectations from EU membership. Now, taking advantage of the fact that these three variables have all the same scale, I've plotted them, and you can see that in the red slope, the economic slope being steeper is, of course, an indication that it is the most able predictor of support for the EU in comparison with the other two. Turning now to the categorical model I was just speaking about, a good thing is that I think overall respondents have understood the direction of the options, because the positive options all have an average level of EU attachment, which is higher than those options which highlighted negative consequences of EU membership. We do see that those who equate the EU with economic growth and jobs have the highest average level of attachment to the EU, and in opposition, as one would also expect, those who equate the EU with the loss of national culture are the ones which are least attached to the EU. Turning now to the so essentially these results, it goes without saying, support the initial hypothesis of the paper. I now turn to the experimental design, and here respondents were basically randomly allocated within each country, so it's a block randomization by country. And here what we did was we allocated respondents into two halves. One half goes to the control or baseline group, so 50% of the sample, and they saw absolutely no treatment whatsoever. They just answered the question without seeing any manipulation. And the other half, the other 50% of respondents, went into one of possible 6 groups, each one emphasizing either a positive or a negative implication of the issue that they are attached to. For instance, those in 1A, they see a positive economic manipulation. Those in 1B, a negative economic implication of EU membership, and so on and so on. So essentially, this is the allocation, the treatment allocation. Because we have a bit of time, I usually in presentations I don't talk about the vignettes, but because we have some generous time, so essentially the economic treatments would emphasize access to the European markets, increasing exports and bringing money into country, allowing country to grow faster, create more jobs, and achieve better standards of living. And in opposition, the negative one would emphasize competition in the European markets, driving industries out of business, contributing to economic stagnation, loss of jobs, and lower standards of living. So essentially, the opposite, let's say, the polar opposite of the positive manipulation, but always with the same elements. And of course, these would be translated and adjusted in each country according to the country that it was being implemented in. And the same thing for the cultural treatment. Being in the EU entitles all European citizens to reside in any territory of their choosing, allowing citizens to expand horizons and know other cultures. So essentially, this would be a more cosmopolitan vignette emphasizing freedom of movement. The opposite being, of course, emphasizing uncontrolled migration, which could potentially weaken national culture. Of course, this is not exactly symmetric, but I'm trying to emphasize the most popular argument in both the positive and the negative camp of those who think that, of those who emphasize cultural implications from EU membership. And finally, in the security treatment, it's the same logic as before. One would think that being in the EU, so because all member states share a common responsibility, this is a common denominator, in strengthening the external borders of the EU, this shared responsibility would render the country safer against external aggression than it would be outside the EU. And in the negative frame, this would expose the country to more external conflicts, rendering it less safe than it would be outside of the EU. And here are the results. So, of course, this is still a work in progress. I would still like to explore heterogeneous effects and see how these effects pan out in different subgroups of the population, potentially also between countries. But the overall situation is as this. It is good that, again, I think respondents have understood the direction of the frames to a large extent, with the averages of those positive treatment groups being generally higher than the control group, represented here by the vertical dashed line, and the averages of the negative treatment groups below the control group. So those who didn't see anything. So this essentially indicates that the directions of the frames were understood. Now, in terms of the size, I think the interesting conclusion here is that we have one exception to this, which is security negative. So those who did not see any type of manipulation, although non-significant, but I think this is interesting to a certain extent, those who did not see any manipulation at a lower level of EU attachment than those who saw the frame highlighting a possible risk of increased risk of exposure to foreign aggression by means of being within the EU, which means that I think it means they didn't buy it, essentially, especially at this time. We're talking about April 2022, so a couple of months after the invasion of Ukraine. It would be very implausible to think of the EU as a possible source of exposure to conflict rather than a common security, especially because at this time the EU was framed as the West, we stand united with Ukraine, united amongst us. Finland and Sweden were starting to think about joining NATO. So, of course, this would be an implausible vignette, and so the result may be explained as this, although non-significant. Now, in terms of the size and significance of the effects, we see the interesting conclusion, I think, is that the positive frames had an effect in comparison with the control group. The cultural and the security significant at below 0.05, and the economic positive significant at below the 0.1 levels, whereas the negative ones did not. So essentially, this means that these would suggest that positive communication emphasizing positives of EU integration, such as freedom of movement, economic welfare, national security, would generate an increased attachment to the EU, while in opposition, that anti-EU rhetoric frames highlighting the negative implications of the EU, which are often used by populist parties or political actors to mobilize contestation against the EU, have a more limited room than would be potentially initially expected, which is potentially a good news. The main findings are here. I would maybe prefer to discuss a bit what I think are the shortcomings of the paper and where your feedback will be most welcome. So one thing is that this paper talks about how the war in Ukraine may have changed an ex-ante scenario where cultural drivers were most important, and I derived these. I assume that cultural determinants were important in the pre-Ukraine time, not because I have data on it. I don't have. I only have data for 2022, so I have an empirical limitation on that end. I depart from this point by theoretical and not empirical, not from an empirical avenue, which basically means I cannot compare data from before Ukraine to data with post-Ukraine. So the fact that it is a merely cross-sectional only 2022 paper, whether it can be a limitation or not, given that the paper in a certain way emphasizes a certain change, a change which I cannot measure with empirical data. The second limitation, I think, it's not so much a limitation as an opportunity. I think that despite the fact that both the experimental design and the observational data deal with the same thing, to what extent do economic, cultural, and security expectations from EU membership impact on the way in which you feel attached to the EU? they are probably a bit too much to pack in only one paper, and they obey different orders of design and different research ambitions. So I'm thinking of eventually separating them into two papers, and I would also like to hear what you would have to say on this. The third thing is that I still haven't investigated, it's still a work in progress. I still didn't investigate potential cross-country variations, and particularly also within countries among different subgroups of the population. So all these heterogeneous effects are yet to be explored. And finally, also, I would like to hear what you would, what suggestions you would have to improve the robustness of the findings, eventually using other data sets as robustness checks or otherwise. And this is essentially, I'll probably leave the conclusions up if you want to read during the discussion. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.